Hi there, and welcome to Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers. I'm your host today, Benjamin Shaw. Shapers is the podcast show that brings you African leadership stories in all spheres of society, where we interview exceptional individuals telling us their story.
This podcast is brought to you by EXEO Capital. EXEO Capital is a leading alternative private equity fund manager that through its 15-year history have focused on investing in African businesses with purpose and impact. EXEO covers the whole of the African continent with investment teams based in Cape Town, South Africa and Nairobi, Kenya, currently managing investments in 9 African countries. The core investment thesis revolves around partnering with exceptional businesses and their teams that have the ability to impact Africa in the decades to come. EXEO does this through providing growth capital to these businesses, but more than that, leveraging a partnership ethos with the companies they invest in. For more information, please have a look at their website, www.exeocapital.com. That is www.exeocapital.com.
Since the start of the Shapers podcast, the approach to interviews has remained the same. Engage in peer-to-peer conversations by asking the questions that we would most like the answers to. Today on the show, we have Riël Mallan, not asking, but answering questions, as our guest, and he talks about the shaping, making, and building and breaking of his own career over time. As with all episodes, this was a conversation full of best practice and inspiration, and he offers lessons and reflections of his life as a leader and now as a private equity executive.
We hope that you will enjoy today's conversation as much as we enjoyed recording it. Without any further delay, let's dive into our next episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers.
Riël Mallan is known to every listener of the podcast as our primary host, but today he's going to join us as a guest. He's only hinted at his own story and background in small bites along the way. We get the opportunity to dig along in his journey to find out some of his agonies and ecstasies and learn what makes him tick. Raised by a family of farmers only to disrupt his own business model, Riel built the Unlimited Group to R1 billion in turnover in just over a decade, and exited in 2019 to become a partner at EXEO Capital. Riel is part of and served as the chairman of the Young Presidents Organization, or YPO, Africa. His executive roles include directorships at Nurture Brands and Vital Health Foods, alongside several others. Riel grew up in Paarl and has studied at INSEAD, and our paths first crossed as he mentored at the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation. To quote from his own words, podcasts are a great way of tapping the wisdom of successful and interesting people. And certainly, Riel has many interesting stories of success and of failure to tell. Thanks for sitting on the other side of the table today, Riel.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to actually be on the other side. After 40, let's just look now, after about 40 odd podcasts, it's great to have a new energy on the other side. We've been crossing paths for a long time. We've known each other for a long time. Or in your life, it's been a long time. My life, it's a bit longer. So
High percentage.
Maybe not that long. But it's great that you bring a new angle. And to the listeners, I hinted in the previous episode that there's new things coming. So Ben and I met each other, as he mentioned, when I was a mentor at the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation. And we kept contact, and I've been observing Ben's career over the course of the last 10 odd years, how it's developed from where he was a student and a product with the Alan Gray Orbis Foundation, how he went into the job market, how he then started a business, HouseMe, which I was an angel investor or one of the co-investors with Ben and his co-founders. And we saw that, we went on that journey together, which had its own agonies and ecstasies.
Many.
And then Ben has now also joined us at EXEO Capital with a lot of the experience that he's gained over the years. So it's been great to see your career. And I think what we're trying to achieve with Shapers, Makers, Builders, and Breakers is to showcase these kinds of experiences, the ones that you don't always hear about, and the leadership stories that you don't always hear about. It's very easy to speak about the successes of life, and hindsight isn't the only exact science. But it's difficult to come by these leadership stories that shows you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'm looking forward to having you on board. I know that a lot of the values that I subscribe to, you do as well. And this is what we're going to try and do in coming episodes. So we're 40 episodes in. We hope that this is the beginning of at least another 100. And we're going to shake it up regularly to try and make it as interesting and as impactful as possible. So yeah, great to be on this side of the table. And yeah, happy to tell a bit of my story. It's been a long time coming. But the thing is about life is that when you're living it, is you don't always stand back and I think have an opportunity to try and get some perspective on it and to sort of provide some perspective on it. So yeah, great to be here.
Well, there's been a number of questions coming in. I know that you fielded them to have you tell your story. So we get a chance to do that today. And it's a real privilege to be the one interviewing you. I remember one of the very first quotes you gave me, as you say, probably 10 years ago now, was from Ralph Emerson. He said, "The mind once stretched by a new idea never returns to its original dimensions." And I recall you quoting that quite liberally as I started. So let's start at the beginning. Your journey to today. You've accomplished a lot. You've become a really influential voice in the private business landscape, but it was hardly the obvious direction. So tell us about your family and how you grew up.
Yeah, it was definitely not the obvious direction. So I grew up the son of a farmer. I am the 11th generation in South Africa. So the Mallan ancestor arrived here in 1680. He left France as part of the Huguenots that fled France at that stage for religious purposes. They fled France and came to South Africa. If we look at the Mallans have documented everything exceptionally well. So 3 of them left, his brother, and his father Antoine, and the manifest shows the 3 of them got on, but only one got off. So clearly something happened on the vessel, most likely some sort of disease or scurvy or whatever the issue was at that stage. And there's a few other questions. So why did only 3 men get on the ship? Where were the wives and the children? So probably a traumatic story there somewhere in the background. So I'm the 11th generation since then, and for 11 generations they've been involved in farming in some shape or form. So my father was a product of, I think, a sort of bleeding period and a sort of a real great development period in South African agriculture, which spanned the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And the 80s had its own issues, but so he was a quite a successful commercial farmer. He was known to buy and sell businesses or farms. And build them up and then sell them in a time when that was still possible. And that was how I grew up in basically 3 main locations, which is also quite strange. I think for most farmers sort of plant themselves in one place, but I was born in the Eastern Cape, Cradock.
What farm?
So interesting, my family is from Franschhoek. So they had farms there, and my great-grandfather was the minister there, and then my grandfather was the youngest of 12, so all the farms were dished out by that time. But he had a BSc in agriculture, which for that time was already, from an education perspective, was quite unique. He then went to the Eastern Cape, where we had family links, and started farming there. Got my dad farming, and his brother. My father then sold up. They moved to the coast, close to Port Elizabeth, had dairy farms there. In the 80s, sold up there, and then we came back to the Western Cape. And then, that was sort of what is expected of me, and that was the obvious narrative of the family as we make our living off the land. Yes, there's a business component to it, but that's what I was sort of born into, and the perception and the expectation, I would say, probably to a degree, that that was placed on me. But there was a few curveballs along the way. So when I was about 14, my father went from being a very healthy guy to actually being quite ill. He had his first heart bypass at 44.
Sure.
And lots of complications thereafter. So
where were you at the time?
So that was, we already back in the Western Cape. So when I was about 10 years old, we sold up did a very good deal in the Eastern Cape, and then came and bought a table grape farm in Paarl. Sort of the dream was always to come back to the Western Cape, and which he did. But he was not a healthy guy. He also didn't lived a very healthy lifestyle from an exercise perspective. But as they did in those days, they smoked and they ate too much rijstvleis and aardappels, and so he ended up becoming quite ill when I was 14, and that had a profound influence on me in retrospect. You don't know these things when they happen. But and he went, because he was young and he was quite healthy. He was very sporty. I think he was playing tennis, and he was playing tennis he was the number one tennis player for Paarl at that stage. So he was a really sporty guy, and he went from being a very healthy young 44-year-old in the peak, prime of his career, to being ill. And that had a significant effect on his, just mentally on his psyche, and he went into post-operative depression and all the rest of it. And what that did for me was, and it was a small, it was a family farming operation. We had workers, we had 1 or 2 farm managers. It was not a corporate by any shape or form, and it all of a sudden plunged us into a lot of uncertainty as a family. And as a 14-year-old, you're in puberty. You're not nearly an adult in any shape or form, but that sort of forces you to grow up very quickly, and it did.
And Riel, were you the only child?
No, I was the oldest, so it was
Of how many?
Of 3. It was me, my sister, a year and a half younger than me, and then my brother, which was then effectively 3 years younger than me. But that sort of, I think, is where my career really started, and I stepped up and wherever I could as a 14-year-old, and that sort of continued in the years to come as I finished school at Paarl Boys. We managed it, and he was in and out. He later had a second bypass 10 years later. He had 1 or 2 heart attacks in between.
And he continued farming.
And I think that's also where I felt the expectation was that I should come back as quickly as possible. So finished up in 1991 at Paarl Boys, matric, and then went to Stellenbosch. Had the idea to go and study medicine, but that changed purely because of this, because I felt that this is what I needed to come do. And I went and studied BCom with agricultural economics and joined the farm as quickly as I could in 94 and immediately took it over. So he wasn't in any state of mind where he wanted to allow me to, wanted to continue himself. So again, took over the farming operation far too early. Thought I knew everything, knew very little. But what it did, I think, was it kick-started my career and thinking at a very early age, where at 21, 22, when most other people were still finding themselves, I had that responsibility, and in retrospect, it was probably the best and worst thing that could have happened to me, because you always look back with fondness on carefree times in your life, and I didn't really have many of those. But the upside of it was that I probably, in terms of my thinking and my doing, started much, much earlier. Very quickly realized then that the business was in bad shape. So the years since I was 14, so I was about 21 by that time, the few years there was not great from an operational perspective. And then in that same year that I joined the business in 94, we obviously had free and fair elections, and democracy kicked in.
Massive market change, shift in perception at all?
Yeah, so that was something that came in completely left field. So at that stage, agriculture in South Africa, for 2-3 generations, we had a subsidized interest rate of about between 10 and 12%, and inflation was sitting anything between 15 and 20%. So inflation took care of debt. So my family started to adopt, and my father started to adopt a model where you incurred a lot of debt, inflation took care of it. You didn't really have to make much money operationally because inflation took care of that. Interest rate was sitting at 10, 12%, and say inflation 18, so your differential was 6, 8%. So you just had to sort of really run an average business, and inflation took care of the rest. Post 94, it all changed around, and we got to a point where inflation came down to 5, 6, 7%, and then we had the run on the rand, and Crystals moved interest rates up to 24, 25, 26%. And that was something that that we didn't see coming, and really gave us a very bad hit, and we never really quite recovered from that.
And that's the farming operation, or the family, or they're intrinsically linked to
that?
They're
sort of intrinsically linked. I mean, those are it was a family trust, and the ups and the downs. The upside, which then obviously changed the trajectory of my life quite significantly, was that it also brought about deregulation in agricultural commodities. So pre-94, we had a milk board and an egg board, sort of a single channel, single desk marketing system, where you were obliged as a producer of any commodity really to give your product to the government appointed agent. And then we had the Deciduous Fruit Board, and Unifrico, Cape Span later was the government appointed agent, and that was the case with all of the commodities that was being produced really. And being 21, 22, 23 and being in financial trouble, I was really active in getting deregulation to happen as quickly as possible. And we formed lobby groups, and we formed the Young Farmers Association. We all kinds of rebellious actions to get that done. And in 97, Derek Hanekom was the Minister of Agriculture, issued 3 permits for independents to actually start exporting their own products. Now you have to realize that I was 20, so 97, I would have been 22, 23. And by that time, I've never been overseas. I've never, and I was planning to, but I've never been overseas. And I linked up with a guy who got one of these permits and didn't have any produce. We had the produce. My father had a table grape operation at the time, producing grapes for the table market. And those days, the UK was a big part of the market. Tesco, Sainsbury, and then mainland Europe as well. So linked up with him, decided this is what we're going to be doing, and then got on a plane.
Sure.
Bought myself a suit first. So bought myself a suit.
And a tie.
In those days, you actually still went to meetings with suits and ties. And then got on a plane. I remember arriving in the UK and standing in front of the tube station map and figuring this out for an hour before I got on my first tube. So it was luck favors the brave, I suppose, because I had no experience. My father was a farmer. He was not a business guy in the true sense of the word. I've always enjoyed business, and I've always been drawn to it, but I have no role models really in terms of that.
And Riel, the point you make about no role models is interesting, because even from a young age, you'd had to make connections, meet people around. I mean, travel internationally to build that network. And networking has subsequently become a massive strength of yours. Yeah. Was that a conscious decision? Did you realize it at the time, or was it almost forced upon you? I
think it's a bit of both. Look, I mean, I am, believe it or not, I know you wouldn't say it, but I'm not an extrovert by nature. I'm not a typical introvert either. But the networking side of it was something that was part passion. I think I realized I had a passion for it, but it was very necessary. They always say, I mean, who starts a business? Those who want to and those who have to. So at that stage, for me, what we were looking at was a necessity in order to get us out of trouble as a family, because the returns we were getting for the products we were producing were just not enough. So I was flung into this. And it was, but then I think the passion side of it was triggered. So So is it nurture or nature? I think it's a bit of both. But there's most of these skills in my mind really can be adopted, and we're going to talk a bit about what networking is in my mind. But it is, so that sort of triggered it. And we went on to have a very good year, which helped us quite a lot because we were the sort of first movers in the space. The fact that somebody didn't steal everything we actually sold to them was just the grace of God, because I did not have enough knowledge to actually
put in place the safeguards.
No, I mean the risk management, the due diligences. These are all words that I didn't even know about. So it was really all about gut feel. Anyway, so it went on. We founded a small business. So a year later, I realized that being on my own was difficult. We had trouble with the guy that I started the first business with. That business is still going, by the way, interestingly enough. But we picked up, some differences in opinion, and probably 2-3 years down the track. So this was now about 2000. I realized that going at this alone is probably going to be very, very difficult. Immediately, the competition started heating up the year after. More entrants. It was a massive, exodus of independence, or an entry of independence into the sector, and we realized we needed to do something to professionalize this all.
And Riel, to be clear, that's now because of the deregulation. You had the opportunity to go into new markets. People saw that as the opportunity, and they could leverage 30 years of knowledge against your 3.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and to be fair, there was, luckily for us, there wasn't a lot of knowledge outside of the government-appointed agents. So we were all equally inexperienced.
Level playing field, but no scale economies and power of volume.
Yeah, and of course you're supplying into a highly organized market as well. So they saw some coming.
A lot of buying power.
Lots of buying power, concentrated, or that by that time the retailers started to concentrate quite significantly. And then, so we realized that we needed to do something a little bit more professional and to structure ourselves better. And we formed a small business called Fruits Unlimited in 2000, actually, 2001, May of 2000, that's right. And my partner, one of my founding partners at the time, is still my partner here at EXEO Capital as well. So Isaac Strauss and the Strauss family were co-founders with me and 2 other families at that stage. And the idea was to really have this little export office of 5-6 people to just do what we did a little bit more professionally. I was going to continue farming, and realized by that time I wasn't a great farmer, actually. My levels of patience are just not, my attention span is just not long enough. So, the passion was clearly towards the business side,
the commercial
side of things. And by that time it was, I was traveling a lot for the business, and the networking started to really pick up and formalize quite significantly. Anyway, long story short, we appointed somebody to run this business for us. He left. And I, sort of the partners, we were at that stage 3 founding families, not 4. The 4th decided this is too risky for him, and so we actually just 3. Said, okay, we need a caretaker for as an interim CEO, and I stepped in as the interim CEO or managing director for Fruits Unlimited, and stayed. So, and stayed until I left in July 2019.
Sure. And
that was the beginning of a tremendous journey and a roller coaster in many ways. The family business didn't do well. There were all kinds of issues around the market. We had one or 2 really bad years where the entire South African industry actually wiped out. And with us carrying a lot of baggage by that time, we decided to exit the business. My brother joined us at one stage since when he finished studies, and he wasn't there very long, and he came from a consulting background by that time. He spent time with a consultant, and he came to the conclusion, or we both came to the conclusion, that we will be better served by making sure we stop the bleeding in in the family business.
Which was still primary production at that point.
All primary production.
Okay, yeah. But the
supplying into the Fruits Unlimited into the channel we were now creating.
Okay, so the Fruits Unlimited was a distribution layer on top of the primary, and you're looking at primary and saying the risk sits there. It's not good for the family.
Yeah, and that started a journey. We're going to talk about agriculture later, but that started the journey in terms of just realizing the beneficiation of products and brands, and downstream was where you build long-term value. And in 2004, we sold the family operations, and
which would have been a massive moment for the family, 11th, 12th generation farmers, and now quite literally betting the farm on a new business venture, and without your family, or did they come along?
No, at that stage we decided to go separate ways, and my father retired. He was very angry with us.
Sure.
Yes. It was a very tough time for our relationship. He was very angry with my brother and I, and we. But in the retrospect, it was the best possible thing we could have ever done, to actually just draw the line and say there's no long-term longevity. And it's interesting, now that I've exited the Unlimited Group 20 years later, where we were involved in corporate farming. I mean, we farmed larger than we could have ever dreamed of being as individuals. I think agriculture is at a tremendous crossroads again. There are forces at play which I think is vitally important, that farming families, the few that's left, because the consolidation has been continuing, I think the few that's left needs to take cognizance of what's happening at the moment. But we can chat about that a bit later. But yeah, so, and then the journey just maybe to finish that off, we sold. It was a traumatic event for us as a family. There were all kinds of personal issues that happened around that time with my father as well. But it was like you say, it was a legacy of living off the land for at least 300 years in South Africa, which came to an end, and opened the next chapter.
And that next chapter, the Unlimited Group, as you say, we'll come to chat to now. That was a distinct step towards commercial business and away from, I wouldn't say the comfort, but the familiarity of agriculture as your primary activity. The Unlimited Group, as it developed, did stay within agri, and your competency even now at EXEO, as you've sort of tracked that golden thread, has remained food and agri business. Was that conscious? Was that sort of pushed on you by the opportunity that came? And maybe a second to that, you categorize a lot of the people that have come onto the show as being builders, but your interest is wider. We've got shapers, makers, builders, and breakers. Was the Unlimited Group positioned as one of those categories, and how would you see your own journey in those terms?
Look, I think Fruits Unlimited was a breaker. So we had a lot of headwind from the established industry at that stage.
What was it set up to do?
Well, it was set up to disrupt 50 years of controlled single channel marketing. So and not for the scope of this podcast, but we got a lot of headwind from the government appointed agent, from farmers. We believed we were driving the entire sector into the ground. I mean, I was asked to resign from certain bodies when I just started the business. So it was definitely a breaker. I mean, we went completely upstream in terms of just common perceptions. And I think constantly through the lifespan of the Unlimited Group, so Fruits Unlimited morphed, and we'll talk about that now, into a much more diverse, vertically integrated and diversified business. We were importing, we were exporting, we were processing, we went into other commodities. So it was definitely a shaper, in the sense that I think we shaped a lot of the direction of the industry at the time when it was young and inexperienced, and a breaker. We definitely ruffled a few feathers along the way, and I suppose that's been a characteristic of where I feel value can be created. You do create value optimal value when you are disrupting existing models that have become fat and lazy and have not moved with the times. That's where, and if you look at tech at the moment as well, you come from a tech environment, that is sort of the areas where you see most of the value being created at the moment.
Outside value. In fact, it's one of Hamilton Helmer's 7 powers, is that counter positioning. You were a breaker, but then I would say that the group became a builder, and you also established business interests outside of agri over that period of time. You were supposedly interim, but you're the CEO there for 20 years.
20 years.
20 years. So how did you expand your network, your influence, and your own business interests while you were sort of building this disruptive group?
Yeah, I think so. So the passion, obviously, that was triggered with starting this, and to sort of see what an unbelievably powerful tool business is. I mean, it's an organism. I mean, if you have to zoom in on what a business really is, it's an idea, it's energy, really. So there's an idea, there's a meeting of minds, where 2 or 3 people, there's a spark, and you sort of say, this is going to be different than everything else out there. And then energy is applied to it. Energy and passion and networks, which is also a form of energy. And then this starts expanding and morphing, and the snowball starts picking up speed. And it's from a philosophical perspective, business is such an interesting thing. I mean, why does certain businesses work and certain other businesses don't? I mean, and often there are great businesses. I mean, the business that you and I had, put together, that you conceptualized, was a great business. But for some reason, somewhere it picked up a stone in the snowball process and started skewing it. So I think what I realized over the period was the power of business, and that the networks is such an important part of that.
Can we double click on that? Because you also networked extensively into YPO, and I know a lot of the people that listen to the show are aware of the organization.
Yeah.
How did you join that? And you said you'd give us a definition of networking. Could you maybe do that for us?
Yeah. So being passionate about networking, I was always looking for ways to, and there's 1,000 ways to network. And I was always looking for ways to expand that network. And it's interesting at the time, I mean, we had a very diversified business, but it was still quite a concentrated, focused business in, like you say, in food and agribusiness and food and agri supply chain. But I enjoyed and this ever expanding network. So I was at one stage also sometimes wondering why I was building this network, because it started building it into all kinds of other areas. And I was approached by a friend who said, look, if you want a network, this is an organization that you have to become part of. I actually remember the one Sunday afternoon when I ran into him at lunch. And
this was YPO.
This was YPO. So fairly unknown to me, but at that stage there was a new chapter being formed in Cape Town, and I was recruited for that. At that stage, I think you needed to run a business more than $5 or $6 million. Now, the benefit of the Unlimited Group was it was quite established at that stage already, so we were way above that. So qualified quite easily and joined this phenomenal organization, which I have to credit probably with a large part of my education outside of formal education, because you are put into the room with people that are, as a rule, 99 out of 100 of them are far more successful than you are. So all of a sudden, your benchmark about how do you go about networking, how do you go about business, what is success to you, how do you measure yourself? I mean, do you measure up? It moved all of those bars just 20 notches up. So that was quite a pivotal moment. I joined that now 13, 14 years ago in 2010. 2010. So it's, 13 years ago. So, I mean, so networking was, that old, that cliche of your network is your net worth is your network, which is actually bullshit. But I think what network does is that it moves the boundaries of what is possible. And what I mentioned now around the benchmarking of your own abilities, I think that's one part of it. But it also, from a scope perspective, it increases it. And in my case, and it's not in everyone's case where a network necessarily does that, because some people choose to be specialists. I mean, in my mind, there's really a couple of ways to go about it. So you can become really good at what you do. You become a specialist at that, and you can make a great living at that. And some people are just wired that way. Then you've got your generalists, which I would probably classify myself as, where you are interested in a wide range of topics, and then you've got probably businesses that again starts as generalists and then focuses themselves over time and goes back to being a specialist. So from a networking perspective, for me, there's two things. I think, yes, it's about actively expanding it, but secondly, which I realized much later, networking is much more about giving than it is about taking. People tend to, and I think this is where young networkers makes the biggest mistake, because you go out and say, I want to meet a lot of people in order for them, to include me and to impart wisdom to me, and that is not the way to go about this. I mean, you are networking at your optimal level if you are actually becoming the nucleus that gives more than you actually take. You should be the person that people want to be with in order to meet other people. So it's a subtle but very distinct difference.
A node in a network, not just
yes. You need to be the connector, and the connectors are those. I mean, that Malcolm Gladwell book, Tipping Point, is an interesting one, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to network. But and often I find that young people feels they sort of excluded from networks, and they're on the outside and they struggle to get in, and that is usually, in my mind, because they are there to take. And there's nothing that irritates a professional networker more than somebody who's just there to take. It needs to be a reciprocal two-way street. So finding a way to, and that in my mind is powerful networking, is you become the node of the two-way street, or the line in the middle of the street where networking is done from.
And to do that, we'll come back to sort of how you can add value. You mentioned that there were two great benefits to networking in that way. The first is removing or broadening your boundaries, your constraint set. And the second, as I understand it, you're also saying you index or you benchmark now against higher standards. I would imagine for yourself, given that your family don't come from a business background, a farming background, my parents also have never been in business, finding mentors, networking into groups of people with expertise, skill sets, and professional competencies that you didn't have, that I didn't have, that's tremendously valuable for your own development.
Yeah.
So as much as you say you've got to give in order to take, was that a driver for what made it so valuable for you?
I think so. I mean, you need to work much harder if you don't come from that. I mean, you would know. You have a very similar sort of background to business. So, yes, I think, the fact that you realize that you don't have anything to fall back on. I think it's also that beginner's mind is powerful. The fact that you're walking into a sector or a new business that you know very little about. So I think your senses are exceptionally in tune to see what works, what doesn't work. And interestingly enough, now 22 years later, when I entered private equity, I was in exactly the same position. Where I knew the lay of the land around making deals and this and that, but how you go about it in the private equity world is very different to private business. So I was in that again for the last 3 years, of which for 2 of them were actually exceptionally not difficult. I mean, I don't classify high learning curves as difficult, but you're out of your comfort zone. So I think that does contribute quite a lot to the success of any endeavor, for that matter. But yeah, so YPO was an essential part of my education for that reason. The mentoring side of it. I mean, doesn't matter which level of life or business you are at, you find that there are just people who's just so much further and consistently changing those mentoring relationships. I do believe a mentoring relationship's got an intense 12 to 24, maybe 36-month period, and in which you need to assimilate what you can assimilate, and then you need to change those networks, and you need to change those mentors. And I have mentors that's been coming with me for decades on certain topics, and on certain aspects of my life, these mentors comes and go, and that is fine. And any mentor that is worth his salt is also fine with that. So I think it's about finding those relationships that enhances your development. And I mean, the great thing about a good mentoring friendship, and I'd like to call it a relationship, a friendship, because that is essentially what you form, is that it goes through phases, and both parties learn from it. I mean, I learned as much about the tech world when I partnered with you 10, 12 years ago, and sort of going through the ups and the downs of a tech startup and building a team and trying to do this in an African environment. So although I was supporting you from a life skills perspective and from a business skills of whatever I could contribute, I was learning equally as much. So, and that is, I think, the hallmark of a fantastic relationship.
It certainly has become the gold standard by which I can hold up mentors and coaches and other leaders in other areas. But let's come back to what you said about needing to add value. Within the context of YPO, you progressed actually to chair the whole of Africa. That's an obvious example of how you added value. But you're starting out in a new area and you've got lots to learn. How do you leverage that now? When you started in private equity, you would have started with much less to offer than to receive. How do you view that transition?
So it's interesting. So when I just came to a point where the business was doing fine and we were growing tremendously. We morphed it and we changed it and made it we moved towards intellectual capital and patents and varietals and genetics, and it's almost probably a podcast in itself in terms of how we added value and sort of differentiated away from a primary agricultural endeavor to being very intellectually based and downstream. And in that process, but it became quite a focused business in a sector, and we were sort of painted in that corner, and I was getting increasingly frustrated with that. But I was building this network throughout, and YPO chair as a position as an example. I took that on in 2014, took office in 2015. It was a 2-year relationship a 2-year stint where you were the African chair. You interacted with the entire Africa as the regional chair. There's 13 regions in YPO. And then you interacted with all of the various regions and the chairs of those regions.
At a global
level. And you were doing a quarterly board meeting and weekly calls and an exceptionally well-networked position, but very, very strenuous, in addition to a business that you're running at that stage as well. And I didn't quite know why I was doing that. I just came to the point where I realized I was networking for the sake of networking. I was building this thing, and I didn't quite know at that stage, where it was going to take me. And one of my previous podcasts I did with Professor Bill Duggan from Columbia.
He wrote Strategic Intuition.
And that, I have to say, and over the years, I started I read every business management and sort of strategy book on the table. And progressively, as I was getting older, these books started just regurgitating the same ideas over and over. And it's very, very seldom that you get to an idea that is really cuts through everything and is off the charts and has that specific impact on your career. And Bill's running a fantastic program for African business as well. He's going to his second year at Columbia University. And Bill's book crystallized for me to a large degree why I was doing it. I didn't know the benefit of it yet, but crystallized why I was networking. And he used Napoleon as a key thesis around which the book went, and why was he so successful as a general, where you would go into a new battle and you would know exactly where to position the artillery, where to position the supply lines. Here's a river, there's a weakness above that, in that valley. And it came back to the fact that he studied from a very young age. He studied military history, and he was collecting all of these data points all the time. He was, although it wasn't necessarily practical to him, he was basically collecting data. And I know that this is a huge part of successful networking and your success in later parts of your life is where you are, when you're building these networks, when you are interacting with a YPO or an EO, because EO is the other organization, which I think any entrepreneur should join. You get just to add more data points. And when you come into a new scenario and when you come into a new battle, you can draw on that. Napoleon drew on that, those data points, and was exceptionally successful until he made a significant mistake when he did not fall back on his history. And that, I think, for me, crystallized pre YPO why I was doing it. And yeah, so I continued to do that, and at one stage I just post my YPO 2015 to 2017 stint, I was just completely burnt out. So I was just got to a point where the Unlimited Group wasn't, getting up in the morning, it was like, walking through thick mud with Wellington boots. It was just, you go on, but it's just not nearly the passion that you had for it before. And it was I think it was just a 18-20 high energy journey, because at that stage we were quite big, we were diversified. We started many businesses that didn't work. We had our ups and downs. We almost fell off a cliff once or twice. Looked down and realized if we fall off here, we're never coming back. So it took its toll. Travel was intense because we were an international business. And then on top of that YPO, the travel just went through the roof. So for a 2, 3, 4 year period, I would say probably I lost myself a little bit in the process, and in the creative process, and in the process of going through this mill. And by 2018, I remember the moment, actually, I was in February 2018. I was standing at a trade fair in Berlin, and I was looking around me, and I looked at everyone around me has been in this fight with me for the last 20 years, most of them, people that entered the sector. And I just saw a bunch of guys that were really tired and old. And I looked at myself as well in the mirror, and I saw, this season is coming to an end. And there were other concerns as well. And again, that's another podcast around climate change and a couple of other issues that I think our sector is facing. But
which we'll do in the season. We've got some lined up for that.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. So we're actually doing a talk soon as well with Invest Africa around the impacts of climate change and the changes in agriculture. But I just realized it's time for a change. And yes, I started to expand my business interest. As you know, I started angel investing in technology, and I had a few personal investments in one or two other sectors just to start to get to know the lay of the land.
Had a few more data points.
And I think that sort of became a hallmark. And even now, and I took the decision to then go on a sabbatical, which we can talk about now. So to maybe bring it all together, I know you're writing a book about your experiences. And if I ever have to write a book about this formative part of a career, and if anybody is in their, let's say, their 20s and they want to get a silver bullet in terms of find a silver bullet, or want to receive a silver bullet from people like me, is that there is no one. And there is none. I mean, it is you build a skeleton. You build a skeleton of when you go to university, when you have a specific, your upbringing, your circumstances. That's the skeleton of which you as a business person receives, and how you then build the muscle around this skeleton really is a 20, 30-year project. But if you build that skeleton in a solid way, if you have a solid academic basis, you build it on solid ethics, you build it on solid expectations, because there is no such thing as an overnight success. Those who do achieve that usually loses it as fast. But that skeleton is the important part of it. And then the networks, I mean, I see that as part of the muscle, and it's and the experiences and the data points. And as you populate this thing just starts to move quicker, and it knows the lay of the land better. And I think that's the lesson out of and in hindsight is an exact science. It's the only exact science, really. So looking back, I made many mistakes. I mean, not for a second do I want to say that I did everything right, but the one thing I did right was I kept the skeleton intact. I kept the ethics intact, which is the most difficult part, because you often put in, especially when you're an entrepreneur, you often put in front of positions where you can take shortcuts. There's often people that that you can build your success on as on top of their skeletons, for that matter. So that was the one part of it that I think that worked out, and that where I stayed the course, and which now entering private equity and entering Pan-African private equity in a sector that I understand, which is food and agribusiness and agri-related. I look back and I realize that it was just meant to be, and that
all built towards it.
It's all built towards that. The networking in Africa between 2015 and 2017, where I really thought, I mean, I'm spending all of this time, it was 4 months of the year I was spending on YPO and this network. Why was I doing this? And now I look back at it, and now I get it. Now it's, I could put a pin in and say this was absolutely necessary for my next phase, which is where I'm finding myself now. But anyway, so took the let's maybe stop there in 2018, and then we can go on from there.
So I think it's a good time to stop before we look at the new chapter that you've embarked on, and how most listeners will have related to you over the last few years. Before we do that, you've mentioned quite a lot of reflection that you've done, putting muscle onto a skeleton, thinking back to how networking has affected you, comparing yourself upwards. That's not intuitive. That is learned behavior that you've come across, and it's obviously worked. I don't know whether that's journaling or meditating, whether that's discussing with people, with coaching sessions. Give us a flavor for what reflection looks like to a top performing executive, and whether that has differed in your career sort of through the phases of business: early startup, disruption, building, collaboration, and now to some degree consolidation into a new sector.
Yeah, that is, and those are also things that come in waves. So being self-reflective and making this an ever-learning and re-engineering exercise, I think, is a mindset that you have to go into. Because with things that go wrong, whether it's personally or whether it's business-wise, you have to find a way to dissect it and take what you can learn from it. You take the energy of that event, because I always say there's two types of individuals. The ones that it's like almost like Jello, and Jello or a rubber ball. So the Jello, when you splat them on the ground, splatters in 20 different directions. You can never really put it all back together. Where the rubber ball is, the harder you smack it down, the more energy it picks up from it, and it just bounces back higher. So you need to, if you want to embark on this journey of being an entrepreneur and sort of building, and a networker and building something, you have to take the rubber ball. You have to assimilate the characteristics of that rubber ball, that you are going to be smacked down, and you have to just then find systems and ways where you can dissect what happens to you, and draw energy and wisdom from it. And I think journaling, you mentioned that. So I started journaling, and again, I don't know where I picked it up. There were great teachers along the way. I think back. I think the journaling I actually picked up from Robin Sharma, and he was at one stage. He was very. I think it was a book called The Habits of 20 Habits or 30 Habits for Success or something. I'll go and find the book for you, but it's probably not relevant anymore because there's been so many of these guys that's come up, Tim Ferriss and the likes of it. But I came to realize that if you journal regularly, you don't have to journal every day, but if you journal regularly, if you can't put this in words, if you can't take your experience and dissect it and write it down, you have not really fully assimilated it or analyzed it. So writing became for me a very important part of dissecting whatever happened to me, personally, business-wise. And YPO has got something called a forum, which was brought into my life sort of 13 years ago, where once a month you have to work through this with 6 or 7 people that's very close to you and where you develop a relationship with. But the writing part of it, I think, is critical. So journaling, very, very much one of the...
And what do you write about? So that's some people write about the same experience very differently to someone who experiences the same thing.
Yeah.
How have you used that, particularly in the context of building or growing and moving forward?
Yeah. I mean, if you have to... I would say you probably have to split it into 3, and which is also the YPO way, is where you say it's personal, family, because it's not the same thing, and business. And you write about what is challenging, what have you achieved, what do you need to achieve. So goal setting, sort of in addition to journaling, is it's again such a cliche, you need to write down your goals. But I've now been doing it for 15 years, and I look back at what I wrote 12 and 15 years ago. I far succeeded or superseded what I wrote down at that stage. But you verbalize it, and when you verbalize it, you contextualize it, and you start to, just to create and shift your world around it. So writing, without a doubt, and writing, going into detail, even if it's sort of just something you want to mention. I said, I now have achieved this week. We did this deal, but I'm concerned about A, B, and C. And then before you know it, you start unpacking this, and you start saying, and if this happens, that would happen. And you start out to write 2 or 3 paragraphs just as a reminder, and then before you know it, often, you get to 6, 7, 8 pages. And by the time you finish that journal entry, if you put enough time to it, you have dissected and you've almost written down a project plan, or at least verbalized and put an order to something that's usually quite chaotic in your brain. So I think that's the benefit of that. So writing, having a journal, and I use an online one purely because you can refer back to them quickly. Whereas with written journals, they get lost and they get, kids start drawing pictures in them and all kinds of things. So I actually think there's some great, Benzu is the one that I use, but there's a number of them. Yeah.
And the journaling experience that you've articulated now, you've developed over many years. It sounds like you've had great teachers. You speak of Robin Sharma as an example who brought you on. Has a lot of your experience in the last 20 years been learned behavior, or do you think there are parts of it that you were born with and kind of have fulfilled over the course of your life? And how does someone who's not sure whether they're cut out for a particular role or job or entrepreneurial path, how do they assess that?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is learned behavior. I think you have a genetic predisposition. You are dealt a hand of cards through your environment, through your parents, through your upbringing, through your physical and financial means. I mean, we all dealt a hand of cards, and I think that 70% of what you need can be learned behavior. That 30% is unique to everyone, and you need to go and decide, given your passions, given your natural abilities, because at the end of the day, they functioning within your natural ability is a large part of success. There's a guy that's been coming to the forefront now, Joseph Campbell. So he died in 1984, I think, but he was the inspiration behind Star Wars. So Joseph Campbell wrote The Power of Myth. And he was an expert on myth and sort of the stories that civilizations for millennia, the same stories come and goes. It's about the wounded hero and his journey of ascension, and sort of first he goes down into the valleys of despair, and then how he rises up. And this has been coming for millennia. And there's a 6-hour interview that was done on Skywalker Ranch with Bill Moyer, I think, was the journalist. But a phenomenal piece of wisdom that's now resurfaced, and this guy is become popular all of a sudden again. But he makes one point. He says that if you follow your bliss, he calls it bliss, and if you move within your bliss, doors and avenues open for you that you did not even know existed. And it's a powerful statement in the sense that you have to realize that if you have to move too far off center from who you really are as a person, then it goes with a lot of effort and energy. So if you can find within your skill set, your own unique skill set, and everyone has that unique skill set, if you can figure out what that is, which is, I think it was that Picasso quote where he says the first half of your life is just trying to find out what you're good at or who you are, and the second part of your life is to give that to others. That was the quote. I'll go and pull out the quote for you. But I think that's the thing. I mean, it's about can it be learned? Yes, of course it can. Most skills can be taught and can be learned by someone. Do you want to do that? You will get much further if you early on realize what you're good at and what you're not good at. I am not good at a number of things. But making peace with that, and then surrounding yourself with teams, partners, mentors that can shine light on these dark, blind spots, get you just so much further. And I think that's the recipe for success at the end of the day, is to make peace with who you are, to learn what you can learn, because there's, all of the skills can be learned, and then to hone the ones that you're really good at. Because the ones you're not really wired for, you're going to be at best average at them. And
you're not going to enjoy performing them. You won't enjoy engaging with people who it is a passion to do.
And that's a very good point, actually. I mean, if I sort of that burnout experience and I didn't quite have burnout. I mean, I didn't end up like many other people do. But I think that burnout experience and burnout in general is when you are functioning outside of what you're good at. And I mean, I look at the last 3 years since I've joined EXEO. It's probably the busiest of my life. But I don't get tired. I really don't. The level of energy that you unlock in yourself, if you are functioning within your bliss, is infinite. And you don't step in those traps. Yes, you have to manage yourself. Self-management is something that you learn over this period. And I didn't. I mean, at 39, 40, I was 116 kilos. I am now 96. So, I mean, I was 20 kilos heavier because everything except my body got preference. And, it was a 3, 4, 5 year journey of getting back to, who you are, getting the disciplines in place, because you're managing this entity being you, and it's got a physical component, and it's got an intellectual component, and it's got a spiritual component. And if any one of these things sort of is not looked after and is not kept in balance, you're going to crash and burn. And I look at, it was quite a penny drop moment for me. I mean, when Nelson Mandela died, he was born in exactly the same year as my grandfather, which was, I think, 1910. My grandfather died when I was a month old in 1973. Nelson Mandela lived until, I think it was 2013. He literally had 2 or 3 adult lives, more than my grandfather. My grandfather, got to do very little, a fraction of what he did. So finding a way, and looking at him, he went through much more than my grandfather did. But he was a deeply spiritual man with the ability, and he had developed this ability in jail to manage himself and to manage this entity which he was, with the impact that it had on the world. So I think finding in all of this, and you come back to the reflection side of it, when it's going badly, when it's going physically badly, is and I also come to journal at the end of the year. What's my weight? What's my blood pressure? What's my net worth? I mean, so all these metrics around, what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed at the end of the day. But those are quite important, I think. I mean, that self-management part of it.
Well, just want to bring that to a finer point. It's crudely said that we should manage our lives like a business, and I think that point is correct, but it's often misunderstood. It's not that we should be making business level decisions for ourselves as individuals. It's that we should take as much care in managing our lives as though we were running a business with metrics, employees, and the factors at work in it. And what's really interesting, and thanks for sharing sort of your personal journey there, but the balance that you've been able to bring has been out of kilter for parts of your life. And over a longer period, you can look back and say you've achieved balance. But there have been periods of time, stretches of time of years, where it's been quite clearly out of balance. You're probably journaling then, acknowledging it and saying, well, I've just got to get through this and then I can change it or shift it. And I suppose in a microcosm of that, every year there'll be something we do too much of and something we do too little of. But over a period of time, we want to look back and say, yes, it was well balanced in what I was looking for.
No, I think that's well said. I don't believe in balance.
Okay.
I think balance is a goal. It's a pendulum. It's the pendulum, it's a grandfather clock. And the pendulum swings out to the one side of it, and it reaches its far right, and then swings back, and for a second you are in balance in the middle. Right. And then it swings out to the left. And if that pendulum stops swinging left and right, the clock stops. So I believe that you need to have a true north in terms of what you are aspiring to, which you think is, which is balance for you. And everyone's balance is different. So I don't subscribe to the fact that there is I hear these self-help gurus about, balance and work-life balance. Because for me, I enjoy work tremendously. I enjoy studying about aspects of work when I'm not working. So is that work, or is that free time? I don't enjoy golf because I don't have the attention span for it. But is it wrong? No, it's not. I mean, some people enjoy that. Some people need that break. So it really is about finding what is that true north for you, realizing that nothing is achieved by having a pendulum that just sort of stays in the middle and swings left and right, because you're neither here nor there.
History is not written by people with a non-swinging pendulum, and you're saying the swing of the pendulum is going to be different for each person, and that's right. That's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think that shows there's energy in the movement. But history is also written by people who's completely swung out to the other side and shattered the pendulum. So yes, it is a balance, but it is in the dance of making sure that the pendulum doesn't swing out too far to the left or to the right. And I think that's my philosophy.
It's a helpful way to look back at what you've shared about your journey and see that having taken place. Riel, we said we'd speak now about this new chapter, the opportunity you've got to sit on the other side of the table, as it were, and not in the podcasting sense, but now not driving the business as an operator, as a CEO, rather finding businesses to invest in, to partner with, as part of EXEO Capital. You left, as I recall, the Unlimited Group in 2019, and you joined EXEO, which, for anyone who isn't aware, is an alternate asset manager, a private equity manager, as you mentioned, is Pan-African. That's quite a big change. What has it been like? Why? And what are you looking to achieve in this new role?
Yeah, so the move to private equity or to an investor, to being an investor rather than an operator of businesses, was it's sort of a natural next step. And whether it's if you're a businessman selling your business and you start to invest in other businesses, or that sort of is a natural progression. The progression to private equity, and specifically EXEO Capital, which is not an impact investor per se, but where impact is a significant part of what we're trying to achieve, was a natural one for me, just both from a skills perspective, but also from a philosophical perspective, in terms of trying to have as much impact as you can
through the lens of business, as you said.
Through the lens of business. If you look at Africa, we are the last frontier. If you just look at the stats around electrifying South Africa, just to make sure that 50 or 60% of Africans have 24/7 access to electricity. Just the investment in that over the course of the next 30 years is just staggering. So I do think we're finding ourselves on a continent, or a continent with great potential. It's the youngest continent. We've all seen the figures. We'll have 1 in 3 young working people in the next 20, 30 years will be an African. We'll be the youngest continent in the world, including China and in India. So Africa, in that respect, holds a lot of potential. Lots of challenges as well, but a lot of potential. So EXEO's role that was established really 12 years before I joined. 12 years before I joined. We've been going now for 15 years, of which I've been part of it for 3. Is a natural progression for me. The canvas, obviously, that we have to influence in Africa, these aspects that will change the trajectory of Africa, is tremendous. The partners we have, the investors we have, which many of them are development finance institutions, and developing these strategies with them around, and then being the agent that facilitates that is great. But where the intersection for me is, and hopefully for EXEO as well, is I've been part of the blood and guts fight on the pavement for the last 20 years. So I think the approach that I bring or want to bring to the portfolio companies that we invest in is one of much more of partnership, that we understand, and that I understand what where they're coming from and what they're going through, because that's what I went through for the better part of 20 years, and all the trauma and the agony and the ecstasy that goes with that. Yes, and then what the learning curve part of it of private equity is just how private equity looks at risk, how we look at return on investment, how it's calculated, how what are the drivers, how do we pinpoint the drivers and go after them. So all of a sudden, the things that I did do as an entrepreneur, but you often find that the ends always justify the means, or necessity is the mother of invention. You often leave some of these principles aside because there's a short-term crisis.
Needs must.
Yeah, exactly. So marrying the two was the learning curve for me. And there's I think there was, for me, I can look back at the last 3 years, and I think I'm a much more rounded executive, purely because I have now experienced both sides. I still tend to lean over a little bit to the operational side, which I have to just pull myself back from. But yeah, so that this is a great new chapter, and it really is harnessing the skills that I feel I developed over the course of the last 20 years, and leveraging it and bringing it to entrepreneurs that can have a major impact. We work with fantastic teams across Africa and in South Africa and or sub-Saharan Africa with great visions of impact. And if we can assist them to get there faster, the impact that they will have in the next 20 to 30 years will just be so much greater. And that's a great position to be in.
And a real way to add back the expertise that you've gained in the front lines over many years, back to entrepreneurs who don't necessarily have the support networks of a Silicon Valley or a founder network of Western Europe. So that's a real benefit. Maybe quick fire a couple of questions on the experience now sitting on the investment side. What are the surprises you've had working on the other side of the table?
I think one of the surprises, I suppose it was expected, is that I think there are major gaps in what both sides of the table knows.
Mm-hmm.
An entrepreneur doesn't know what he doesn't know. So often like me, I was in a business for 20 years. It is to a degree very, very limiting because you don't really move outside of it. So that's a great thing that I think private equity brings to the entrepreneur, and on the vice versa, on the private equity and capital side of it, also not always a great understanding of the dynamics specifically in Africa. So that was it was expected, but it was a bigger surprise than I thought. Surprised at how little focus Africa is getting globally, given the geopolitical situation, given climate change, given food security. I mean, we are receiving a fraction of global investment, and there's this perception of risk, some justified, some not. So, but I realize that how we are so small in terms of the larger global capital markets, and we sitting here in Africa, we don't feel it, we don't see it and think it, but we are really not on anyone's agenda. More so in Europe. I think Europe has been far more focused on Africa than the US or Asia, for that matter. I think the interesting, our South Africa and Kenya has got quite a deep economy, but how shallow the economies are in the other parts of Africa, where we're not attracting global capital flows because there is just nothing to invest it in, or not those kinds of numbers. I mean, you've seen some of the big private equity houses put together African funds, and then they would dissolve them because they can't find the deals. And we're seeing some of it in EXEO too, and we've adopted around that to create some of these businesses, because we need to create bigger businesses in order to attract proper capital flows. So that was a real eye opener for me. And I think and on the other side, how a little capital can make a massive difference in the lives of individuals. We see some of our portfolio companies, someone like Margin Par. I see the culture that was created, a bit of discipline, the Kaizen methodology, and it has the ripple effect of it just in terms of excellence is fantastic. And then the last one is that there's pockets of excellence in Africa, which just blows my mind. And some of them we've invested in. We spoke about CPT, which is the only active pharmaceutical ingredient synthesizer in the African continent, and the expertise, the chemistry expertise sitting here in South Africa, which we don't know about.
World class.
So, and this needs to get airtime, and hopefully what this podcast will be doing, and over time as well, is to showcase some of these pockets of excellence, because the world needs to know about this. It's not known. So yeah, those five, I would say.
Those are really wonderful insights. And Far, who I know has been on the show, speaks of these pockets of excellence in education. He speaks about it in entrepreneurship, in business. You've given a few examples of it. Just lastly, and I want to say thank you. It's been really illuminating. I think I know you quite well, but I know you a lot better after this opportunity. You've mentioned Tipping Point, which is Malcolm Gladwell, Bill Duggan's book, Strategic Intuition, Robert Sharma. What are you reading at the moment? And perhaps another couple of resources you would recommend everyone read by 30, 40 years old.
Yeah, those are good ones. Although it's complicated, and I don't think the book actually has the gives you the traction that unless you've been through the mill a bit, is Ray Dalio's principles. It's great how he's tried to put it in algorithm, but it's very specific to his sector. But there's some great life lessons in there.
Mm-hmm.
And Yuval Harari's work, which has become it's a bit of crossover around, it's quite esoteric in many ways in terms of looking at, where we are finding ourselves as a human race. And where this civilization is finding itself, I think, is worthy of reflection for everyone. Your generation and the ones following you has a huge challenge in balancing, what the world we're living in and the planet we're living on. So I'm finding myself gravitating towards a lot of that. And there's there's a number of books. Yuval is one. I'm just trying to think now of. I'm reading a lot of history because history does tend to
repeat itself.
Reading a book around the Medicis at the moment of Florence.
Yeah,
and I'm finding myself reading a lot of crossover religious work at the moment, where I'm finding it more and more apparent how similar we are as humans, but how we are, with the smallest of differences, whether it's religious or ethnic, is how we just completely pulling it outside of its the real perspective. We are. If you look at the geopolitical landscape and you look at the Ukrainian war, or you look at Trump versus the Biden, or the Democrats and the Republicans. There's much more that joins us than what divides us, and yet we're focusing on the 10% which divides us. And I find it a fascinating characteristic of humankind, why we can't get over the 10%. So I think that's sort of, I'm gravitating towards that. But that would be the area where I'm reading a lot at the moment.
Message of unity.
And I'm finding, the great thing about these days between audiobooks and physical books and podcasts. I read audiobooks and physical books, so I would read a chapter at night and then I would listen to 2 chapters on the road. I'm working through much more than I did in a long time, because our world's become very busy. You don't really get time to sit down and read a book. But using all the various media like podcasts, which has opened the world for me.
And now you can listen to yourself, giving yourself wisdom.
Yeah, no, I'll skip this one.
Thank you so much, Riel. It's been really great to have you on as your own guest.
It's a pleasure, Ben. Yeah, thanks. And I'm looking forward to the angle that you're going to be bringing to this podcast. Your network is great as well, and you bring a new generation of entrepreneur to the podcast. So hopefully we will really live up to our name of being shapers, makers, builders, and breakers in Africa. And hopefully we can get our listeners to send us even more candidates to bring onto this podcast to try and accelerate something on this continent, which I think is gaining momentum, but needs a lot of work to make sure we take our rightful place in Africa and in the world.
Thank you, Riel.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you for listening to this episode of Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. We trust that you've been encouraged by what you've just heard. Subscribe to future episodes and find out more about us at shaperspodcast.co.za. That is shaperspodcast.co.za.
Well, that's right. Don't forget to subscribe for new episodes and other content, and remember, share any feedback with us. We'd love to hear from you. Find me on Twitter at B_D_Shaw. We look forward to your company the next time on Shapers, Makers, Builders and Breakers. Until that time, cheers, bye-bye.